He was born in Ireland and was once chief of his country's military intelligence. Today, he is president of his country. There's little doubt that his closest ally is the United States. And next year, Israel and its president, Chaim Herzog, are asking their closest ally to increase the aid it sends to Israel to more than $5 billion.
That's a bargain. You've got for that sum the equivalent of the force that you've got in West Germany. So, in my view, the United States' involvement with Israel is a function of United States interests. The United States is doing this not only because Israel is an ally, Israel has common values. The United States is doing this because it's good for the defense of the United States.
It's also good for the defense, the survival of Israel. Israel's chief preoccupation is the military. 40% of the national budget, a third of the Israeli workforce, directly or indirectly. The occupation of southern Lebanon cost $1 million a day, peanuts to the Pentagon, a major expense to Israel. The invasion and occupation also changed Israel's image with some people. Some people now see Israel as kind of an aggressor. Have you sensed that at all among Americans?
For a time, yes. But you mustn't forget that 1/5 of the population of Israel was under Katyusha rocket fire from across the border for years, in fact. I don't believe the United States or any other country in the world would have reacted differently if from across their border they'd been attacked as we were.
It's a long way from Dublin to Jerusalem, the holy and political capital of the Jews. Jerusalem used to be divided into Arab and Jewish sectors. The Israelis unified it by force in 1967. In Jerusalem is the modernistic White House, actually a beige house, where Herzog, Israel's first citizen by vote of the Knesset, lives and works. How did he get there? Well, his role model and inspiration was David Ben-Gurion, first prime minister of the country. His death is commemorated at this memorial in the Negev, the southern desert.
I had the privilege of working, not with him, but very near him, in the War of Independence. And here you saw the founder of a nation in many ways. It's as if, in your terms, somebody had worked with George Washington.
Herzog was born in Ireland, the son of the chief rabbi of Dublin. On his way to the presidency, he trained as a lawyer, went to Sandhurst, the British West Point, became, after independence, chief of Israeli military intelligence. Out of the army, he became a popular commentator on Israeli radio. Then Herzog was chosen to be ambassador to the United Nations, where Americans had a chance to get to know him. You've spoken rather unkindly about not only some of the members of the UN,
yes,
but of the organization itself. Since you left.
The organization is being destroyed by being hijacked by the extremists, by the Arabs and the communists, and the radical third world elements, who've just sort of taken it over and trying to turn it into a vehicle for their own frustrations. The UN itself is a very important body, which is being destroyed by part of its members. And it could be saved by the West if they only had the guts to do it. And I must say that I'm very pleased that the United States government has begun to take a very firm stand in the last few years. And when they announced that if Israel is thrown out of the UN, they will leave, that more or less put an end to it.
Now, in the Beige House, it's clear that arguments at UN headquarters are secondary to the home front crisis.
Of course, we're heading towards 1,000% inflation. We're weak. There've been problems, but we're playing from strength, basically. And therefore, I believe I give it 1 to 2 years before we're out of the woods. But we're on the way out now, in my view, because we have a strong government, a unity government, with enough strength in the Knesset to be able to push through some very, very unpopular measures.
The facts are the government is not that unified. The unpopular austerity measures are so unpopular, a lot of Israelis ignore them. They make the dollar, not the steeply sliding shekel, their currency of measurement, and the black market in Western consumer goods like refrigerators and cars and VCRs flourishes. There's a dark suspicion among some of the president's countrymen that the post-pioneer generation of Israelis has forgotten the blood and sweat and work that created the country and sees it now as a good place to live and not work too hard. Israel, these critics say, has gotten fat and lazy on handouts from Jewish charities and U.S. aid. In the crisis, the government has chosen to pour effort and funds into dollar-earning exports, chiefly military items like sophisticated aircraft and complex battlefield gear like drone surveillance systems. Herzog and the executives of Israel's aircraft company hope this gamble will help solve the balance of payments problem. Israel's economy is slowly changing from agriculture, making the desert bloom, to high-tech. This makes worse the division between light-skinned Jews of European origin, better educated, more ready for high-tech than the darker Jews from North African and other Islamic lands, whose background and culture were far simpler. There are other divisions. Secular and religious conservatives unite in some hardline policies toward Arabs. Herzog has to deal with an Orthodox Jewish population, some of whom would like Israel to be much more of a religious state. On the model of Iran, Herzog thinks not, but he's concerned.
I wouldn't say we've got any Khomeiniism, heaven forbid, here, but we do have a degree of confrontation, of polarization on the religious issues, which concerns me. And if I have to point a finger at the most important problem that we have to face internally today, I would say that's it.
Would you be talking about ultra-Orthodox Jews?
It's not only ultra-Orthodox, it's all the various shades of Orthodoxy and their approach one to the other. It's a question, basically it boils down to a question of tolerance.
The Orthodox Jews observe the letter of Jewish law, and they expect the country to do the same. They feel a moral right to the West Bank and are the main backers of its colonization. Some people say their intransigence leads to a new phenomenon, violence against the Arabs by Israelis.
The problem, it's arisen out of the fact, out of a certain sense of frustration. We're 36 years old, State of Israel, going on to our 37th year, and Arab terrorism hasn't given up all along. And that has created a certain feeling of a desire for revenge among extreme elements. And what disturbs me here is that many of these acts are done, as it were, in the name of fundamentalist religion. It has nothing to do with our religion. Our religion forbids this. It's abhorrent.
We asked about Rabbi Kahane, the American who took his extremist views to Israel and won a place in the Knesset.
He is in the Knesset because we have a certain electoral system which allows for maximum of fragmentation. And if you had that system in the States today, Farrakhan would be in the Congress, the Ku Klux Klan would be in Congress, a lot of nuts would be in the Congress.
Kahane wants all the Arabs out of Israel.
I don't see him as a problem for our democracy or for our society. I see him as a nuisance, and I see him as a challenge to our society in order to overcome a policy which is hateful to us, which is against the Jewish religion. I mean, basically, this man who calls himself a rabbi is preaching what is obnoxious to the Jewish religion.
The objects of his wrath are in a group Herzog believes he can feel for and reach and make a satisfied part of Israeli society.
There were 150,000 Arabs left in Israel after the War of Independence. They number today almost 750,000, 17% of our population are Arabs and Druze, Bedouin. They feel from time to time that they've had the thin end of a raw deal, but they are free to fight on that issue here. They are free to make it a political issue. They are free to use our democracy, our electoral system, in order to advance their cause, and they do it. They use democracy to the hilt in order to improve their position, and they've been very successful.
No matter how successful in improving their state, Israel's Arabs are still really second-class citizens, and they feel it. President Herzog says he's the only head of state in the Mideast who can stroll safely through the streets of Arab communities. But on visits to Arab towns, he's well protected, and he faces a supportive mixed Christian-Muslim audience. He takes care to have a well-prepared message in Arabic, and he can sign autographs in Arabic as well as he can in Hebrew. Herzog is committed to the Camp David agreements, which brought a kind of peace with Egypt, and to further compromises if he can find Arab leaders of like mind.
To put the whole conflict in a nutshell, over the years, Israel has always been prepared for compromise. Over the years, the Arabs have never been prepared for compromise, even by 1%. They've always wanted not only 100%, they wanted more than that. The net result has been that because of Israel's approach, Israel has been successful, and the Arabs, because of their approach, have not been successful.
Keeping 90,000 Palestinians corralled in West Bank refugee camps has been one of the many big failures of Arab policy. These Palestinians may suffer harsh restrictions by the Israeli military occupation, but they thrive on Arab news broadcasts and Arab propaganda from Jordan and Egypt and Syria, with no Israeli censorship. Herzog believes they are watching a kind of sad comedy.
They've just had a Palestine National Conference in Amman, and they still talk as they talked 30 years ago, 35 years ago. The same old hackneyed phrases. But they're not prepared to sit down and talk. Now, there's no problem in the world that's ever been resolved without two sides sitting down to discuss it. They're not prepared to. They want us to lie down and die. We're not constrained to commit suicide. That's all there is to it. We're a people with a long history. And it takes two to tango, as they say, and they are unwilling to sit down with Israel. That's basically the problem.
While Israel waits for a tango partner, the Jewish settlement program may be the biggest obstacle to agreement with the Arabs. There are about 100 small Israeli towns in the occupied area, 30,000 Israelis living in the midst of 1.25 million Arabs. The pro-settlement Israelis believe the Bible and history give Israel a right to Judea and Samaria, the old names that now include the West Bank. Young Israelis continue to move in spite of Arab opposition and substantial questioning of the policy among Israeli voters. Most Jews here indeed do not tend the land, but commute to office jobs in nearby cities. But the settlements and their implicit policy statement are there.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
President Herzog, who has seen a lot of history, points out that Israel's history as a state, while crowded, is brief. Give us some time to sort things out, he says.
Look, Israel is made up of people who've come from 102 different countries. Some of them have jumped hundreds of years by arriving here, from the Middle Ages straight into Israel. All this has been put into a pressure cooker called Israel and mixed together. It's taking time for the final product to emerge.